Hi guys, just quick question. Has anyone ever used a pub quiz machine in a pub before? If you could put your hand up. This guy, cool. You're gonna like this talk. So yeah, I'm just gonna crack on with obligatory who am I. So first of all, I also work at PwC. It's quite funny actually. I'm in the UK, in London, but PwC Hungary have actually sponsored this event. I had no idea. It's kind of a bit funny. But I work in threat intelligence, mostly APT focused, and I basically reverse engineer malware, do malware analysis, behavioral analysis on malicious binaries. I also have studied cybersecurity. I've always been really interested in cybersecurity, and I focused my research and went further with reverse engineering after university, and luckily got a job in malware analysis. This isn't my first rodeo. I've previously done talks on open source intelligence in B-Sides London and Deep Intel in Vienna, which were really good. Basically, I like reverse engineering and understand complex systems. That's my main jam. And if you want to have a chat afterwards or talk to me in a pub, basically, I'm a big fan of philosophy, politics, and English football. So if you can put all three together, you're doing well. So I'm going to talk about how this actual research came about. So I was in a pub, and I was playing on a pub quiz machine with my friends. Pretty standard. I was in a British pub, and we have these pub quiz machines where you can play these games. Fairly interesting. Something that's entertaining while you're having a drink. And one of my friends who I was going to live with at the time basically said to me, wouldn't it be really interesting if we were able to actually take this machine and play it outside in an apartment or somewhere outside of a pub, which I thought was really interesting. Because possibly you could buy it or you could try and manipulate in a certain way to try and get it working in your home environment, which I thought was really cool. So I began looking at this previously, and I extended the research for this conference talk. And for that, I sort of had to explain to people why I was doing a load of research on a pub quiz machine, because a lot of people looked at me and thought, that's kind of a bit weird. So one of the things is that with pub quiz machines, you can gain a fair amount of money by simply, understanding general knowledge or actually just being good at questions that the pub quiz machine has, because it only has a certain amount of questions. So I've got a bunch of news articles here that basically show certain people in the media that have gained a fair amount. So this guy got banned for just being good at pub quiz machines. We've got a Russian hacker or a mathematician that basically was able to understand the random number generation when it came down to slot machines in casinos and was able to predict the correct answer that was going to happen. I thought that was really interesting to see that he was able to gain monetary value from that. And finally, this guy, who's a general knowledge expert, or genius as this article says, gained £60,000 a year, which for me is quite interesting because that's above my pay grade. So this research got interesting. But I started to look at that, and I thought it'd be really interesting to see if I could defeat the security mechanisms in this machine. So back to the pub, obviously, still having drinks, still using the machine, and it froze. It began to freeze. And I thought it was quite interesting. The staff in the pub began to turn it on and off again, as most technical problems are. And what I saw was the operating system. And the operating system was really interesting because it sort of spiked my interest and actually accelerated my research into this. Because when you see Windows 2000, you start to think that's kind of a bit interesting. So this is actually a phone screenshot I took of the machine itself. And once you see a login system like this, it begins to look a little bit interesting. One of my relatives, my dad, he's got a sat-nav that is on Windows CE. So you start to, when you sort of see these screens, you think this would be really interesting to look at for research-wise. And also, as I reverse engineer x86 binaries, I think it's a little bit easier for me to research than maybe looking at other operating system binaries. So yeah, that sort of accelerated my look at this pub quiz machine. So first I thought, how would I be able to look at this? So first thought, maybe acquiring the machine, actually getting the physical machine. You can buy them on online supermarket, online marketplaces, which is really interesting. Fairly cheap for a pub quiz machine. So I first thought taking that avenue and then taking the hard drive out and looking at it forensically. The problem with that is that I live in London and I live with 5 other people, and I'm not sure that they'd be happy about me bringing a pub quiz machine along. So I had to take an alternative route. I've looked at routers before and their firmware, and usually looking at this firmware, I'm able to acquire this not simply by having the physical machine, but actually by downloading the firmware from their site. And that was the same case here. This is a screenshot of their website where I didn't have to have any authentication that I own the machine or any authentication details. I was able to actually just download this file simply from their site by going to the software downloads, which I thought was really interesting. So I downloaded it. And for 3 months, working in threat intel, during my work, I was doing IDA Pro, reverse engineering, malware analysis. I had my dinner, and then afterwards, I was back on IDA Pro. It was an interesting 3 months, I'm not going to lie, guys. So what was in the box? What did I actually download? Well, when I downloaded it, I found that it was an archive, which I thought was really interesting. It was just a simple zip archive, because when I've done previous research, as I've said, on router firmware, usually they have their own custom file compression or their own way of allocating certain space, and you can see compression in certain streams, but it's not just the whole file is packaged in a zip archive, which I thought was really interesting. Every update contains an executable named setup.exe. Now, I was able to actually look at various updates. They had multiple updates for download, which meant I can actually compare the updates themselves, which was really interesting to look at itself. The files updates actually have other archives within them. So there's the archive, and then there's the other archives within them, which actually contain the games and some of the really important processes that are run on this this machine. So what I thought when looking at this is the developer really hoped that no one would be able to gather the passwords from these archives inside this archive, because they were just like a 7-zip archive, password protected, and basically they thought that no one would take 3 months to look and reverse engineer pub quiz machines. That's where they were wrong. So basically, in this archive, the original archive, we had a configuration file. So we had all the archives, and then we had other files like this configuration ini file. So I've played around with reverse engineering games as well, and .ini files usually just have just a variable and then a integer or whatever. It's usually not encrypted, and it's usually not very interesting. Usually has very small amounts of configuration settings. But this had all of the sort of how this update's going to be put onto the system. So setup.exe actually decrypted the file contents during the installation process, which I thought was really good for me, because doing malware analysis and behavioral analysis, what I could actually do is just run this file, and it would just drop the encrypted file into decrypted contents, which was really good. I was able to do this without reverse engineering too much. I was able to understand most of the characteristics of what it was doing simply by just doing what I do day to day. So what we've got on the screenshot, obviously install.ini, we've got the encrypted version there, and then if we go to the decrypted version, we start to see some really interesting stuff that I'd never seen before. So one thing was that it was batch, which was interesting in itself. But another thing was that they were using or had created their own sort of language. They had square brackets and then an instruction and then the parameters that were usually used to execute the function. So with this, I thought this was really interesting that A, they've used someone else's product and used it inside their installation process, or B, they've created their own sort of programming language with batch to actually start the update and look into the machine, which I thought was really interesting. So as we can see there's square brackets text, which would be like console.log or a print function. And then we've got exe_wait, which probably is allowing the update installation to hang while this process is running and then exits, which I thought was really interesting. And then we've also got conditional statements, as we can see. So there's an if statement. But the most interesting thing is this machine is running Windows 2000. It's obviously quite low spec, and it's got cryptographic algorithms being run. and specifically hash algorithms to check the integrity of the actual packages, which to me is really good because it means that the developer is somewhat security conscious. They're doing hashing, and they're not just doing MD5 or SHA-1. They're actually doing SHA-256, which in itself is quite a good thing. So when looking at this machine and analyzing it in some way, I can see that the developer or whoever's producing this machine is able to be security conscious and has read some programming security books. Going a little bit further into this configuration file, and I can learn a little bit more about the environment, which is really good. First of all, you can probably see from the screenshot that we can get some of the passwords for the archives, which means we can extract them. So we've done that job. But as well as that, we can actually understand in this configuration file, there's processes killed, started, there's different files moved around into directories that I don't know about because I don't have access to the physical machine, which is really good. So as well as that, I want to talk about the 7-zip command that's being used there. Now, I usually, as I've said numerous times, to analyze malware, and a lot of malware developers usually put their malware into self-extracting archives that are password protected, and then they have a batch file which executes much like this, which has the password within it, and that in itself is packaged inside a self-extracting archive. So I started to see the symmetry and started to compare malware developers with this software developer and found it was really weird to see similar techniques being used. Usually I would see a developer, or would think a developer that was providing software for a pub quiz machine would usually do import libraries for zips or 7-zips and use password functions in their actual programming than actually creating the process 7-zip and actually using the command line tool, which I thought was really interesting to see for the comparison. Another part that I thought was really cool was that they actually validated the encrypted configuration file. In the setup.exe, they actually compared the first 5 bytes. So we've got GWENC, and they decrypted it, and they checked the first 5 bytes and made sure that no manipulation had been part, or someone had made sure they put GWENC at the start. So they have some level of understanding of encryption, security consciousness, and actually means that they can validate their configuration file somewhat. This first 5 bytes is then removed, and then this file's dropped to the temp directory where it's being interpreted in setup.exe for the next time. The really interesting thing about this installation is that I could run it and it would decrypt the config, but if I went any further, I would have to make sure that I had the specific environment. If I just click next on this installation, it would say you've got the wrong drive letter and stuff like this. And I thought it was really weird that they hadn't initially looked at their environment and made sure that someone was actually running it on a machine and not actually running it on a Windows virtual machine that I was doing. So then we get to the cryptography. Now, I'm not going to dwell too much on this because it still hurts me that I wasn't able to identify the algorithm. But as we can see, well, I've said the OpenSSL library is being used, and I see it in the hash functions. When it's interpreting the script, it's using the hash functions to check the integrity of the archives and the files within this update. And the weird thing about the decryption of this config file is it's not within these OpenSSL functions. It's by itself, and it takes 2 quad words that are put into this function. So there's a few characteristics, and I want to talk about the crypto function for a little bit. There's 2 static values that I would interpret as the keys that are used at the start of the algorithm and are manipulated and shifted around. And these values are always constantly this, and then the configuration data quad words are then also inputted in later on during this, which I thought was quite interesting to see. And then another constant later on is used. It's a pretty standard in quotations, cryptographic algorithm using bit shifting, exclusive OR, and operations in the algorithm. So pretty standard, but I couldn't identify it. And it took me a lesson that when you reverse engineer binaries, you sort of understand is you've got to have a reverse engineer priority. And one of those things for me was actually being able to emulate the games. Going back to when I was talking to my friend in the pub, was basically I wanted to make sure that I could play these games because they were kind of interesting. So I did sort of look like that for the first month. So it was pretty tricky removing myself from that, but I had to look at other aspects of this machine. So a little overview of the files in the archive before I go a little bit further into other parts. Windshell is like the main act as an explorer.exe, add an explorer replacement, but Windshell was used for the most major operations that were used in this machine. It killed processes and made sure that the machine was working correctly. And then there was system DLLs. Now, these are not Microsoft system DLLs. They are the system DLLs that the pub quiz machine software developers have created, and then moved into System 32. And then there's system data. System data is strings and content that is supported and used within this machine, but isn't actual strings used in games or major parts. It will become more clear what system data is in the next slide. And then we've also got the games in the archive as well. So one of the things in system data was this database. I've looked at Internet of Things software where they have an SQLite database that's encrypted and you have to get the password. Now, what's clear here is that the SQLite database was in plain text. So I was able to actually access this database and actually look at the values. So what I've got here is I've got 17,000 player rows in one table, and then I've got 6,000 pub locations in another table. So what's really good and interesting about this is that one table allows me to identify where these machines are. So if I'm able to exploit this machine, I'm then able to go to every single pub and repeat what I'm doing quite often. So 6,000, pretty good. These are only in the UK and Ireland, so I live in the UK, so this is pretty good for me. And then there's also 17,000 player rows. Now, the interesting thing about the 17,000 player rows is that they have pins. So in the pub table on the top of this screenshot, we can see on the far left, there's a location ID. And that location ID is also used in the players rows, or the players tables rather, to identify where the player's located and their pin. The pin is when you get a really high score, you go to the top of the leaderboard on this game, and what they offer you is, if you stay on that leaderboard for 2 to 3 weeks, however long that they have, you will earn a certain amount of money by returning back at that time and putting in your PIN and your user handle, and you'll get this money for free because you've stayed at the top for a certain amount of time. What's really cool about this, from my aspect, is that I can anticipate the software updates that the developers are doing, and once they release the updates, if I get an alert for it, I can reverse engineer this and try and understand this, and hopefully they haven't encrypted it again, allowing me to get this table, and I can try and see if I can get the money from the specific locations before the actual players do, because they're held in this database, which is not great for the players. There's Windshell. I'm going to go and delve a little bit deeper into Windshell. So it boots and kills processes. It also talks with the local web server, which sort of sparked my interest a little bit further as well, because when you see a local web server, you think that's kind of interesting. And then there's also other layer 7 applications that are booted and killed from this machine. And then there's also detect malicious operations from Windshell, like reboot fraud. Now, I'd never heard of reboot fraud before, but basically, every time that someone tries to play a game on this pub quiz machine, a credit will go down. And what the reboot fraud is trying to do is it's making sure that someone doesn't try and manipulate the machine by rebooting it or by disabling certain processes so that a credit will go down. So one of the things that they check for is the registry key disable task manager to make sure that the task manager is still disabled. If it's enabled, it means people are trying to kill processes or manipulate in some ways. They had other ways of looking for reboot fraud, but that was one of the examples that I noticed. It also checks for the expiry of the machine, so there's only a certain amount of time before you have to pay more money to these people so that you can play or provide players in your pub the game still. So that was really interesting to see as well. So basically, it's the overall SEER, it's the watchdog of the operating system. That's sort of an overlay operating system from Windows 2000. Another thing that I noticed with Windshell is it imported DLLs that involved router probing. Now, router probing is quite an interesting term when listening to that. And what I noticed is from the exports of these DLLs, it was something that made me think, oh, I need to analyze that a whole lot more. You can see in the screenshot some real interesting export names: get Wi-Fi SSID, set Wi-Fi router APN config, detect Wi-Fi router. Some really cool, interesting export names. And when I delve a little bit deeper, I noticed, looking at the code, that it was actually looking at TP-Link and Bandilux routers. I don't know how to pronounce Bandilux, so I hope that's correct. And it also looks for APN details. So I start to analyze this a little bit more, and I start to notice that actually it's also got a really specific model that it's going for with TP-Link. So it's really targeted in what it does. So I start to think, why are we doing this? This is a pub quiz machine. This is really weird. This shouldn't be doing this. And what I find out is basically it's a subscription. So if you go for the highest subscription, you get unlimited credits, you get a free Wi-Fi router, you get internet, and you get a free GPRS with it. I think that's really impressive from the developers, that they've had customers that have come back and said, this isn't working, I don't like this network. And what they've done is they've developed a capability what allows them to actually provide support and actually have it just plug and play almost. And I wouldn't expect that really from someone who's a pub quiz machine developer. I would see them focused with the games. I would see them focused on making sure that they had the correct money and any bugs that happen in an operating system, because let's be honest, it's Windows 2000. Then I saw also in system data this. So this seemed to be either the internet or the dial-up details that I saw in the system data. This was just .txt files available once you'd got a password-protected archive. So the developers, their main security mechanism looking at this was basically password-protected archives and making sure that the people that run this install.exe or setup.exe were basically not reverse engineers or people that knew how to do malware analysis. So it's really quite scary that they had credentials like this openly available because you could get free internet. So these are some of the log components in the event logs. Now, I don't know if, I think I've seen Tesco in Budapest. I've had some time to look around Budapest, and I've seen Tesco around. And in London, there's Tesco as well. And when I go back from work, I get food, and I go on the self-service checkouts. And one of the most interesting things that I've found recently is that when they go wrong, the machines, you have technicians that look at the event viewer. And it's very clear with these sort of machines, event viewers are really important for the actual technician that's trying to fix the machines, in this case, a pub quiz machine. And a lot of components are actually put into the event viewer. One of the most interesting ones that I want to talk about here is the firewall, which I have a bracket and a question mark on, because this is a Windows 2000 machine, and a lot of machines, when I look at ransomware, NotPetya or WannaCry, have exploited a whole lot, Windows 7, a whole lot more modern operating system. So it's really interesting. I'd like to know more about the firewall, but unfortunately, they don't update their firewall in the updates, which is a question in itself. But is actually in the physical machine. So I need to be able to, if I was to do next steps, actually look at the firewall from actually acquiring a pub quiz machine. That's something that I would certainly take out on that. There was also another way of updating the games themselves, which was quite peculiar. They had two different ways. The good thing about it was that it was using TLS and was correctly, securely communicating and updating the files in a good manner. And the other thing that I want to point out here is the configuration changes. So they were looking at would they have to roll back configuration changes, or if anyone had manipulated the machine themselves, they would be easily able to look at the event logs. The problem with that, of course, is that you can clear event logs. So just a little segue from quite a lot of other things, a little short note. I find really interesting with malware developers and software developers, when I'm analyzing their binaries, it's super interesting to see little bits like this, little file names, little comments, to understand their sort of the way that they actually go about their programming. But because for me, I'm looking at how the techniques of a programmer or the certain characteristics of their binary can be identified compared to other binaries. That's what I do for malware analysis. And I just found it quite peculiar that it was called temp666.dat as the machine expiry, quite peculiar. Another thing that I noticed is that developers still get unhappy even if they're not developing malware. They still don't like Windows sockets, apparently. So these little patterns and these little identifiers allow me to understand the characteristics of a developer. So I've talked a lot about some of the operating system overlaid over Windows 2000. I want to talk about why I should emulate games. So when it comes down to the games, they have the questions files if they're question games. There's also gambling games like roulette or whatever. But they have just a compressed file with all of the questions in. Now, I could target and attack that, but I'm quite lazy, and as well as that, the compression can change quite easily. Each game can have a different compression. So I want to just make it easier to just run the games to make sure that whatever happens, whatever compression, I can just run these games, because they have to run in a certain environment. They have to run in Windows, and they have to run with certain graphics, and they have to run with a certain amount of specifications, because the pub quiz machine is limited in its resources. So it also allows me to understand the quiz machine environment, because it's calling out certain file locations, it's communicating in some way that allows me to understand the environment. And I've said a lot about the environment, but because I'm essentially reverse engineering the machine without the machine, I have to try and understand it without the physical machine. And why emulate the games? I don't want to buy a machine, that's why. So there's custom game communication. The local web server I previously mentioned or referenced. And I've got on the right there some of the commands that are used by this binary to communicate with the local web server. And as you can see, B, C, bank, credit, these are quite common monetary communication, so you could easily quite manipulate this. As well as that, there's multiple ways of actually getting credit, which is quite an interesting one. But it's a good thing for me, because when I look at malware analysis, there's raw sockets communication that uses custom protocols that I can think of in my head and sort of look at this and try and understand it. So it was really cool to see that they'd created in a sophistication point of view. They hadn't used like a get or a post when it comes down to HTTP communication. They'd used their own way to communicate with their own local web server. So when it comes down to emulating the games, I want to be able to run the games, but I also want to be able to change the credit, because I can run it, but then I need to press start, and I need to have money for that. I need to be able to go on the next part. I could patch the binary to just go straight to where I need, but I saw it as a little bit easier, because when I was reverse engineering the games, I saw the same function coming up, which was the get credit function. And what it did is it loaded, it had DLLs imported into it. It called one DLL, which called another lower level DLL. I'm quite lazy, as I say, when it comes down to reverse engineering. So I just took all of them DLLs and just was like, no. And I decided that the return value that they would provide, I would manipulate that in some way. So here's an old version. So we have the EX going into the D word, and we've got the call. This is quite small. And then we've got the new version. And that's more sophisticated. And what's really interesting is, when I look at malware, is the tools, techniques, and procedures, is it progressively getting better or worse or whatever. It needs to change its detection. But when it comes down to this, I can see some huge changes from a small function like this to this, where it becomes more sophisticated. Now, you might be wondering why get tick count is so often here. It's because it's looking at a timeout to exit the machine if someone's been idling on the machine. So after multiple attempts at patching, I had to make sure that I made sure that the static value I set was low enough, otherwise it would crash. That I identified that it used Rad Game Studio, so it was doing Delphi, which was quite identifiable when I put it in IDA. I also found out it was using Bink 2 video technology. Now, these are some of the things that were really interesting for me if I wanted to create my own machine, remove all the security aspects and the protection aspects, and just making sure the games worked. And what I did is I put it into a DirectX wrapper, and because what happened is it was a touch screen, this machine, it would remove the mouse, so I needed to enable the mouse again, because I didn't use a touchscreen, and I needed to make sure that I changed the screen resolution, because it tried to force a certain screen resolution on me. As well as that, I needed to get these rare DLLs because I didn't want to emulate them. Luckily, they were on public sites if you're good enough to find DLLs. And I'm sorry for the blur. Sadly, when it comes down to work, I can't show the manufacturer or their games, because that's just not a good idea. But on the top right, hopefully you can see that £2.50 is in there, and the game is playable. I know that you guys probably have never played that game, so you're like, I can just see blur, but that's how much I can show. But it was just really interesting that I was able to defeat and patch the credit and actually run it as well. So what? I was able to get the credit restrictions, remove them, which means that I can now sort of remove my the look of the machine and trying to use the machine now. I've researched enough to actually understand the machine a little bit better. We can learn the questions now and just go to the pub and actually, if we wanted to, I'm not saying I would, I'm just saying we could if we wanted to, guys. And we can also debug the game. So when it comes down to the gambling games, obviously, you want to understand the random number generation. You understand the different decisions that it makes to actually predict it, like the Russian hacker did when he was looking at slot machines. Conclusions, it's still Windows 2000. I cannot say that enough. The highest that this machine would go to is Windows XP, which is quite worrying. Because the base OS, they had some quite difficult things when it came to specifications and limiting themselves when it came to the games. There were some really interesting privacy issues. Possible Wi-Fi attack vectors. I didn't need the physical machine anymore. Another thing, the comments and debug statements that the developer made, really interesting to see. It helped me reverse engineer a little bit. The random number generation in Windows 2000 has been proven to be bad, so I can look further into that avenue. And it was really interesting to look at, to be honest. 3 months was pretty interesting. I've said interesting a lot. I do understand that, guys. Finally, thank you for listening to me talk for a very long time, and the guys given the conclusion. Don't leave pub quiz machine software open for download. Thank you for listening, guys.